Within the musty corridors of medieval power, where alliances were forged in blood and secrets could spell ruin for an entire realm, a drama unfolded, capable of shaking even an era accustomed to ferocity. A 12-year-old boy was elevated to the rank of senator, becoming a mere pawn on a chessboard meticulously laid out by his father. Yet, the dynasty's triumph turned into a most brutal tragedy, for the exorbitant ambitions of Teodoro, Marquis of Montferrat, demanded a horrific price, the life of his own son, Octavian. The subsequent events not only overturned perceptions of power and family ties, but also provoked unexpected changes, endangering nobility, commoners, and the entire realm. This chronicle bears witness to the abuse of power and institutional violence. Depictions of brutality will be omitted, but the essence of what transpired runs deep and true. What began as an act of savagery ultimately became a lesson in resistance, echoes of which resonate to this very day. In 1387, northern Italy was ablaze with internecine strife. Duchies, marquisates, and mercantile republics waged fierce battles for every scrap of land, as if for precious metal. Alliances formed with the sunrise and dissolved before sunset, and no one could feel safe in this atmosphere of instability. Montferrat, a small but strategically vital marquisate, found itself caught between powerful forces, the Duchy of Milan, the House of Savoy, and city-states desperately fighting to maintain their influence. In those times, for nobles, power was not an inheritance, but a battlefield where one had to fight every day. In this struggle, children became valuable instruments. Appointing a child to office was a common practice, ensuring a compliant voice and, more importantly, bolstering the image of dynastic continuity. The Montferrat Senate, formally an advisory body, in reality served merely as a facade, controlled by the most influential families. Decisions made there were already agreed upon in private conversations, away from public scrutiny. It was within this atmosphere of ceaseless warfare, clandestine intrigues, and a Senate reduced to a mere theater, that young Octavian of Montferrat was drawn into political games, unaware that for his father he would be not a son, but merely an expendable piece on the chessboard. Octavian of Montferrat was born in Casal Castle, in the heart of the Marquisate. From an early age, his life was marked by a paradox. He was a child, yet he never knew childhood. By the age of 5, he was studying Latin, diplomacy, and the art of war. At 8, he listened to state councils alongside adults, and at 10, he accompanied his father to negotiations upon which peace and war in the region depended. Historical records of the era portray a youth endowed with a discerning gaze and an intellect far beyond his years. He demonstrated an ability to grasp complex political matters with a depth that perplexed even the most seasoned diplomats. In stark contrast stood the figure of his father, Marquis Teodoro, a man timid, cunning, and steeped in profound distrust. For him, power was synonymous with absolute control, and obedience was regarded not as a virtue, but as an unconditional duty. This chasm between father and son proved fatal. On one side, a youth with an analytical mind. On the other, a father prepared to suppress any display of independence in the name of preserving his lineage's stability. At the age of 12, Octavian was granted the title of Senator of the Realm. The solemn ceremony took place within the walls of Casal Cathedral. Opulent purple robes, intricately embroidered with gold thread, oaths sworn before noble lords and members of the clergy, and at the center of it all, a child who had become the embodiment of dynastic hopes for the future. For many, this event seemed merely a political maneuver, yet something more profound than mere blind obedience lay hidden within this young being. For several months, Octavian skillfully played the role assigned to him by his father. He was invariably present at all meetings, remained silent, and voted in strict accordance with instructions. He was Theodoro's ideal puppet, a compliant figure on the chessboard. However, the young Octavian soon began to awaken, realizing the full gravity of the decisions made within the Senate's walls. He witnessed how new taxes mercilessly undermined the welfare of peasants and merchants, and with bitterness he understood that the voice of the common people would never reach those majestic marble tables. In February 1388, like a spark, the flame of defiance ignited. The Senate was discussing the details of a military campaign against the Duchy of Savoy, planned to be financed by new unbearable taxes on the populace. Against his father's will, and regardless of the potential repercussions, Octavian rose from his seat and, his voice filled with firmness and conviction, declared that such a burden would lead the people to utter destitution and inevitably provoke a rebellion. A deathly silence fell over the hall. Experienced senators, seasoned in political intrigue, gazed at the youth with undisguised astonishment. Had this mere boy dared to challenge the powerful Marquis in the presence of all the nobility? Theodoro, crimson with rage, ordered his son to be silent and sit down immediately. From that moment, his father ceased to see Octavian as merely a compliant heir, realizing that before him stood a potential threat to his power and authority. Following that memorable speech in the Senate, the relationship between Octavian and Theodoro underwent irreversible changes. What began as a mere disagreement escalated into a protracted and hidden war, unfolding within the walls of the ancestral castle. The Marquis, unwilling to tolerate dissent within his own family, decided to tighten his control over his son. He replaced the progressive humanist tutors who had fostered Octavian's critical thinking with strict conservative teachers who instilled only one lesson: unquestioning obedience. He forbade his son from meeting other young nobles, fearing that his rebellious spirit might spread, and confined him within an increasingly narrow, controlled, isolated, and suffocating circle. Theodoro made a grave miscalculation, believing that silence was tantamount to submission. Contrary to his expectations, Octavian did not break under the yoke of power, but found sophisticated ways to resist. Secretly immersing himself in the study of philosophical treatises in Latin, he established an underground network of contacts among lesser nobility. Gradually, ideas that questioned the immutability of his father's authority began to form in his mind. The Marquis, naively believing he had suppressed only a small spark of defiance, had, in fact, fanned a flame that soon threatened to rage out of control. In a chamber where maps and flickering candles created an atmosphere of secrecy, the Marquisate's influential figures discussed strategy to counter the pressure from the Duchy of Milan. Everyone expected blind obedience from the young senator, but Octavian, barely 13, made a decision that stunned all present. Convinced that the peasants would become innocent victims of the impending war, he passed information to enemy envoys, hoping that they, in turn, would show respect for the rights of the common people. When news of Octavian's actions reached Teodoro, his world was shaken. For the Marquis, obsessed with total control, this was no mere youthful rebellion or display of naivety. This was betrayal, a stab in the back, delivered by his own flesh and blood. The council chamber became an arena of unbearable tension. The nobles whispered, suggesting various options, sending the youth to a monastery, exiling him from the marquisate, imprisoning him until he understood his transgression. Yet Teodoro seemed not to hear them. His gaze was fixed, cold, and directed into the void. A grim, meticulously conceived plan was brewing in his mind. If his son dared to challenge him, he could become a symbol of resistance, and a symbol, as is well known, is more dangerous than any army. Therefore, the Marquis made a final, irreversible decision that erased everything that made Octavian an heir, a man, a potential rival. On that fateful night, within the profound silence of the ancient castle, the tragic destiny of the young senator was sealed, a fate that surpassed even the cruelest customs of the dark Middle Ages, leaving an indelible mark on Montferrat's history. After that ominous night, Octavian seemingly vanished into oblivion. The Marquis solemnly declared that his son was gravely ill and required solitude for recovery. However, with each missed public event, general bewilderment grew. How could such a promising young senator, one who showed such great potential, remain without signs of recovery for so long? Young nobles who saw Octavian as an alternative voice in the Senate began to feel uneasy. Some persistently requested an audience to visit him, but all their pleas were rejected under spurious pretexts. He has a high fever. He is not receiving visitors. Behind the impenetrable castle walls, servants whispered about what no one dared to speak aloud, that the youth was no longer himself, that he had been broken, that he had been silenced forever. The church, disturbed by the ominous rumors, did not remain aloof. The Bishop of Casale, driven by apprehension, requested a private audience with the Marquis, suspecting that something sinister lay behind this supposed illness. Meanwhile, in the city squares, the common people murmured in indignation. To them, Octavian was no traitor. He was the youth who had bravely defended the interests of the poor against new taxes in the Senate. His disappearance was perceived as punishment for speaking the truth. Prayers for the young man's recovery gradually transformed into veiled protests. Beneath the flickering candles and the whisper of collective prayers, a dangerous sentiment began to stir, a seditious thought that even the Marquis's absolute power could be questioned. While the outside world seethed with rumors and conjecture, within the castle walls, Octavian's personal, invisible battle unfolded. Stripped of his former identity, estranged from his usual social circle, and under constant surveillance, many in his position would likely have succumbed to fate. Yet Octavian chose a different path, that of hidden resistance. He mastered the art of outward obedience while carefully preserving the memories of his days in the Senate. In his mind, he recreated political battles, devised alternative strategies, and gradually honed his thinking, achieving an unprecedented depth and strategic acumen. In secret, he began to write. Using homemade ink crafted from rudimentary means and quills found in the courtyard, he filled sheets of repurposed paper with political reflections, reform projects, and sketches of what he saw and heard within the castle corridors. His confinement, paradoxically, played into his hands, bringing him closer to the Marquis. Teodoro, convinced that his son was completely neutralized, did not hesitate to discuss confidential matters in his presence. Unwittingly, he supplied Octavian with invaluable information about the impending crisis, thereby inadvertently helping him prepare for future changes. Octavian, a prisoner in his room, managed to establish contact with the castle staff. These individuals, who had always felt his respect and kindness, became his trusted informants. Through them, news reached him of the growing unrest in the surrounding villages and of the pressure exerted on his father by other states. Octavian, stripped of weapons and an army, discovered something far more potent, the realization that true resistance begins in thought, and that even in silence one can prepare the ground for future change. The winter of 1389 descended upon the Marquisate, bringing not only harsh frosts, but also ominous news from the borders. Milan and Savoy, having joined forces, were preparing for an invasion. Concurrently, the peasants, exhausted by unbearable taxes, revolted, setting barns ablaze and dealing with tax collectors. For the first time in a long while, Teodoro found himself in a situation where his power was under threat. The Marquis, known for his coolness and shrewdness, now paced the castle in bewilderment. His advisers offered contradictory solutions, from negotiations and flight to brutal suppression of the rebellion. None of the options seemed to offer salvation. Octavian observed his father, seeing in him not an omnipotent ruler, but a man who did not know what to do. Every gesture of despair, every sigh confirmed what he had written in his secret diaries. The Marquisate was teetering on the brink of an abyss. It was in this gaping breach of weakness that a unique opportunity for Octavian emerged. Marquis Teodoro could not have imagined that the very son he had sought to keep in the shadows, whose opinion he had ignored, would become his only salvation. One night, as frost gripped the land, Marquis Teodoro seemed to break under the weight of circumstances, collapsing into his chair. Enemy forces were only 2 days' march from the castle, and the rebellious villages blazed like beacons of despair. For the first time in a long while, Teodoro looked like a man defeated even before the battle began. And then something unexpected happened. Octavian, his silent son, who until then had seemingly dissolved into the shadows, spoke. But he spoke not as a victim, but as a confident adviser. "Father," he uttered with unexpected firmness, "I have carefully analyzed this crisis for several weeks, and I see a way out of the current situation." Teodoro cast a furious glance at him, which read, "How dare he?" But deep within that gaze, a flicker of desperate necessity could also be discerned. For hours Octavian meticulously laid out his plan, which in its foresight surpassed all proposals from the Marquis's advisers. He proposed inviting the enemy forces to the negotiating table, not as invaders, but as potential trade partners. The Marquisate controlled key routes to the Mediterranean Sea, which was the true objective of Milan and Savoy. Concurrently, Octavian proposed unprecedented tax reforms aimed at alleviating the burden on the peasantry, which, in turn, would restore their ability to produce goods and, consequently, increase the crown's revenues in the long term. This was a bold and radical approach, utterly unthinkable for an era accustomed to wars and repression. But for the first time in months, Teodoro heard something that offered a faint hope of salvation. That night, the son he had once tried to break became the only one who could save the realm from imminent destruction. Octavian's conceived plan gradually began to take shape, yet not everyone was prepared to accept it unconditionally. During council meetings, the most conservatively inclined nobles vehemently expressed their disagreement, shouting accusations of treason. The very notion of trading with those who had once sought to seize their lands, of reducing the tax burden on audacious peasants, seemed to them an undermining of feudal society's foundations. In their view, the young senator's proposals constituted political sedition, an encroachment upon privileges they had defended for generations. However, Octavian, unfazed, displayed considerable diplomatic skill. He meticulously studied the aspirations, fears, and weaknesses of his opponents and methodically began to win them over. Thus, to Count Castellamonte, his fiercest adversary, he entrusted a secret that rendered him speechless. Deposits of high-quality salt had been discovered on his lands. With the opening of new trade routes, these resources could bring the Count untold riches, surpassing all his previous earnings. Faced with the prospect of either losing everything or multiplying his fortune to unimaginable proportions, the Count changed his stance, and others followed suit. Step by step, Octavian, like a seasoned strategist, transformed the council chamber into an arena for his political maneuvers. He employed not brute force, but subtle diplomacy, insight, and a gift for persuasion that few expected to see in a youth who had known such bitterness. The one who had once been silenced now compelled the Marquisate's most influential figures to hang on his every word. What many had deemed recklessness was, before their very eyes, transforming into a political miracle. The agreements forged with Milan and Savoy not only averted a bloody war, but also transformed long-standing enemies into advantageous trading partners, invested in the Marquisate's prosperity and stability. Trade routes leading to the Mediterranean revived, filled with caravans of diverse goods, which inevitably boosted the entire realm's welfare. Concurrently, the tax reforms began to bear fruit. The peasants, freed from an unbearable burden, regained the incentive to work. Crop yields increased, markets brimmed with goods, and with them the treasury's revenues grew. However, the most significant changes occurred not in the economy, but in social life. For the first time, representatives of different estates, nobles, merchants, and peasants, were given the opportunity to gather in consultative assemblies initiated by Octavian. There, voices that had previously gone unheard gained strength, and pressing issues found prompt and fair resolution. The Marquisate, which had teetered on the brink of collapse, experienced not merely a revival, but a transformation into a flourishing, resilient, and unified land, such as it had never seen before. And at the epicenter of these changes stood he, a youth who, having lost everything, managed to transform his personal pain into a force capable of altering the course of an entire people's history. The young man, once humiliated and silenced, now rose to a figure far surpassing an ordinary political leader. Octavian managed to transform the tragedy he endured into a rare virtue, profound empathy. Unlike many aristocrats, he knew firsthand what it meant to lose absolutely everything, and this experience shaped him into a ruler of an entirely different caliber. When he visited settlements, he did not arrive to display power, surrounded by guards, but to listen attentively. He took the time to converse with the elderly, widows, and ordinary peasants, barely making ends meet, striving to find individual solutions for each specific problem. Such a style of governance not only caused surprise but also served as a source of inspiration. Soon his image ceased to be associated with the humiliated son and transformed into a symbol of hope for thousands. Octavian, displaying admirable discipline, turned to writing. From his pen emerged the famous Treatises of Montferrat, invaluable documents in which he articulated his profound reflections on justice, reconciliation, and the true purpose of power. These texts, destined to stand the test of time, would centuries later be recognized as a precursor to modern ideals of human rights and democracy. Thus, the youth, deprived of the joys of social life in his early years, and having known the brutality of his father's upbringing, managed to transform into something entirely unexpected, a guiding star for his generation and for times to come. Despite his premature death at the age of 26, Octavian of Montferrat's funeral was an event that transcended typical noble ceremonies. Common peasants, skilled artisans, respected clergy, and even high-ranking foreign ambassadors gathered to pay their respects to the departed. All those present realized they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. His life, overshadowed by his father's cruel treatment, paradoxically transformed into a priceless legacy of justice and reconciliation. His insightful letters and noble deeds sowed the seeds of ideas that, centuries later, would inspire humanity to forge new forms of governance founded on respect for human dignity. Octavian's story serves as a poignant reminder that even in the bleakest circumstances, an indomitable spirit can transform pain into a creative force, and abuse into a source of hope for a better future.